folks. If you haven't seen the stuff we have in the Cova lobby, have a look at it. It's stuff that I just got this last summer, and I don't pretend to be an expert on any of this stuff. I really got interested probably when we all started hearing about Ukraine in the news, but I've learned a tremendous amount, and I think it's really it's an interesting story. So, and I want to thank our two students from Russia, Val and Dina. I don't see them, but if you're here, great. Thank you very much. Well, I don't see anybody actually. So. yeah, I do hear you though. So, okay, now I'm going to start out. Okay, now this is an interesting image because we're looking down at Europe, and I always thought the center of Europe was France. But if you believe this map, the center of Europe is Ukraine. And although maybe they picked one where the rest of Russia is covered in clouds. But in any case, here, and now, we're going to zoom in a little bit, and we're talking about the area just on the north side of the Black Sea. So you can see above Turkey there where it says Turkey and Ankara. The Black Sea is that big body of water right above there. And the Ukraine is above that. And of course, you know, Russia, Belarus, and Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia are north of that. But anyway, we're really, it's Europe, you know. And here, now we'll zoom in a little more. And now we can see Ukraine is a country with the Dnieper River running through it. And the interesting thing is that joins with a river system that actually goes all the way to the Baltic Sea in the north, right? See up there in Lithuania and Estonia. So there actually is a connection, a direct connection. And it's probably why the history of Russia grew the way it did. Okay, so now I'm going to start out in the early prehistoric stuff, and the reason I'm going to do that is because of a particular culture called the Kukuchini Tripilian culture. And this lasted from 5000 BC to 3000 BC. This was a long time ago, a tremendously long time ago. You can see the area where it says Kukuchini at the top there. And there you can see it. It goes over the country of Moldova into Romania and has most of the central part of Ukraine. And this is an amazing culture, an incredible culture, incredibly early. This is long before Egypt, you know, before Stonehenge, before any of that stuff. And this is really the first world culture that I've discovered that had painted pottery, had ceramics, and the patterns are breathtaking, and I've never seen anything like them anywhere. And you know, they remind you of all kinds of things, but it's just, they're just beautiful. So there we are. And Kukuchini is the Romanian word, and Tripilian is the Ukrainian word. It's the same culture, you know, long before any of those languages existed. So here's an interesting, sort of an idealized image of this sort of strange, perfect world of 3000 to 5000 BC. Circular towns filled with really interesting buildings. And you can see the cow in the sky. Of course, in those days, the most valuable thing that a person could own was cows. And in the beginning, this is before domesticated horses. And here's just some modern imagery of some of the houses from the period, which are really interesting. Now, of course, none of these are preserved, but they've dug them up in plan, and so they know how big they were, they know what the floor plans were like, and they used to make models of these things out of ceramic, so they know what they looked like. And it's really interesting, and the patterns are breathtaking. You know, this is before Egypt, before any of the stuff that you've seen a zillion times. Now, the ceramics that they made are fairly soft, and to be honest with you, the colors of the paint don't stick very well, and they're almost always found broken. But there's a little one that I have in the display case, and I've got a big one up in my office. And but these things are just fascinating. They remind me of all kinds of things, you know. if anything, it's strange that they look like Native American pottery. Here's some spoons that are painted. And this is some jewelry that's made out of seashells. And look at these things. They're just amazing. And they're, the patterns I've never seen before. And I mean, this is the Neolithic era, And the culture starts before the Bronze Age. So this is, well, the Neolithic culture, right? And this is the one that I have, which I just got fairly recently. And then here, they didn't have wheels that were fast, but they had turntables. So they were able to make things that were much more symmetrical. But they didn't actually spin the wheel and then work on it when it was moving. They had much more sophisticated kilns for ceramics than a lot of other cultures. And then here's some of the most beautiful things. Now, I've actually seen very similar ceramic bowls like this in, of all places, Colombia. In South America, but they claim they don't know what these are, but the ones in South America are all for makeup, and their eye makeup and things like that, and they use them top or bottom. That's the reason they look the same, and you could pick them up with 2 fingers. It's actually really convenient, and but it's interesting, to look at a culture that, at least for me, I've never seen anything like this. This is, when I was in school, this was an alien world that nobody ever was aware of. Look at that. Really interesting. Look at that. The sort of spikiness of it all. Strange. Have you ever seen the Jomon pottery from Japan? If anything, it's kind of like that. And here's the big one that I have, which is, the colors are preserved not too well, but still. And they found most of it. and you can see the burn mark on the bottom where it's been set in a fire to heat something up. The little cup that I have has 2 holes poked in it. That's for hanging it from the ceiling. If you just set something on the ground, ants or something could get in food. So they would hang things from the ceiling. And it's interesting that often the bottom isn't very flat. That's because they really didn't have much furniture, right? And look at here, some of these things. Yeah, look at that. That's five spouts on a pot. I just love this. Now here's an interesting image, supposedly, all reconstructed. Here's an interesting thing, though. It's not clear, I think whoever did this sort of did it automatically, it's not clear whether the potters were men and women. In ancient America, all the potters were women. And it's hard to say. Here's more reconstructions. Reconstructions are interesting. Always assume they're kind of wrong, but if you just look too much at what's preserved, there'll be a lot that you just can't see. These things have heaters in them, so that you can heat things up and keep them warm. Pretty sophisticated. That thing in the foreground is actually a model building. And these were found, these fancier ones, the multi-piece ones, were found in buildings that they think were religious buildings. Quite often there was a ceramic facility that made these specific ones. And then on the top floor, they believed that there was a kind of a shrine. And these were used for some kind of religious ceremonies. Of course, we don't know anything about them. We don't know their language. They didn't have writing yet. And but look at that. I mean, it's awesome. And then they started making these figures, and they're mostly figures of women that typically they call goddess figures, and typically adorned with these kind of swirling patterns. And you see similar patterns in prehistoric things in Ireland and northern Scotland, places like that, France, Neolithic France. But look at these little goddess figures. This is a tradition, of course, that goes all the way back to Lascaux Cave and the stuff during the Ice Age. And there's a pot that really looks like a person. Now, often these things are found in multiple ways. You'll find it. Most of them seem to be women, but some of them are actually men. Sometimes you'll find one of each. And here's a set that were found actually in that position, right? And here's one of my favorite ones. They found them in a ring, you know, all facing each other. And interestingly enough, see, they're sitting on chairs. And I've looked at the history of chairs, and this is the first depiction I've ever seen, the oldest depiction I've ever seen of furniture. You know, pretty interesting. And if I compare these to any type of furniture in the world, I've had to say the only thing that looks like this is in Africa. And but since these things have been discovered, there's actually a lot of interest in the aesthetics, and they've started to do fabrics and clothing that grow out of these patterns, you know, and pretty interesting. Here's just some of the flat patterns. Yeah. That's a whole different aesthetic. Look at these models, they're amazing. I've seen some very early models of buildings in Greece and in Italy that might be somewhat similar. The arched roofs you also see in Scandinavia, but much, much later. This is very early. And they've excavated a lot of these buildings. Now, one interesting thing you have to remember is that probably looks like the building did, but it doesn't tell you what it was like inside, and it doesn't tell you how it was made, but it does show how it looked. And here they've excavated, and you can see the ground floor there. They've seen where the various rooms are. They know where the posts are, right? But to be honest with you, they don't know any detail about the elevation. They're just guessing. And if you see anything in an elevation like this that's reconstructed, anything that's ugly, it's probably wrong. That's the way I always judge, you know. But pretty interesting. That actually looks like at least a shrine in Japan. Pretty amazing. And here's a plan of one of these supposed religious buildings with a shrine apparently on the top floor, and the lower floor with a whole series of workshops for making clay things. And the reconstructions they've done of the houses are pretty interesting because they were apparently completely painted on the outside. And you can see the sort of columns made out of bundles of reeds. And look at this is wild. You know, there's nothing like this. And it's funny, if you take these reconstructions and you compare them with all the architecture of the world, once again, Africa is where you see things like this. You know, and here's one that's raised off the ground. Pretty wild, you know. Now, of course, these are all reconstructions, so, you know, the poor level of craft for the thatching on the roof is probably because it's done by scientists that don't really know what they're doing. If you see good thatching in England, you'll see it just looks miraculous. It's just smooth and shiny. The Japanese thatching is amazing. And, but pretty interesting. This is a log structure on the bottom, a mud and wood structure above. And here's some of the plans of the towns. Pretty amazing. Yeah. Long before Egypt. That's an interesting, see that photo? That's Africa. And you'll see the same sort of thing, you know, the same porches, the same thatch roofs, the same painting on the walls, you know. Interesting. Now this is a reconstruction of a Tripilian interior. You can see it has some ceramic things that are probably for water. There's a kiln in the corner, an oven. There's sort of a sleeping area that's raised up at one end. And to be honest with you, everything you see in elevation is imagined because they don't really know. But interesting, and they have found the ceramic pots in these positions, and you can see there's what looks like a bread kiln in the background. Pretty interesting. It's interesting because if you look at early reconstructions of Native American stuff, this culture didn't have any saws. They had axes, but they didn't have saws. So neatly cutting a board was really difficult. You know, just cutting a tree down, you're doing it with stone tools. You know? And so the wood parts don't tend to be really well trimmed, typically. Now look at here, this is really amazing. This is a model of what looks like a 3-story building. You know, and so there have been various attempts made. I'm sorry, that thing changes twice. Here, maybe it's part of a wall. You can see these are just attempts trying to imagine. This thing was found busted into a whole bunch of pieces, but it's a facade. I don't know, it looks like Orvieto Cathedral to me. You know, it also looks at the big flat facades on Native American buildings in British Columbia. You know, we're imagining most of this stuff. Maria Gimbutas was one of the first people who studied this part of the world. And I think she was originally from Estonia and Lithuania here. And she taught at UCLA in Los Angeles. And she had a lot of interesting theories. And her work was very controversial. But actually, it's really interesting. The most, I think, important thing that she did was she postulated where the birth of Indo-European languages started. And there was a debate between her and Colin Renfrew, who was a professor at Cambridge. And Colin Renfrew always believed that the European languages originated in Turkey. And she wanted them to be at the north side of the Baltic, or the Black Sea, which is now Ukraine. And sadly, after she died, they did a bunch of DNA testing, and Renfrew actually announced that he was wrong, that it really was from Ukraine at the beginning. Now, Indo-European languages are pretty interesting, right? And I don't know if you've studied these very much, and I haven't either. But here's a really amazing thing. There's maybe where it began, but virtually all the cultures, ranging from Iceland down to India, the languages are descended from the same language, from this group. And it's amazing, the connection. You know, there's Proto-Albanian, Anatolian, which is from Turkey, Armenian, Balto-Slavic, which is still in the area down there, Celtic, and then below Celtic is Germanic. Yeah, where does English come from? It comes from Germanic, Greek and Italian, Latin are all Indo-European languages. And here, if you look at some of this, see there's Italic, and you can see the languages that descend from Italic. Portuguese, Galatian, French, Italian, amazing. Celtic languages, Irish, Scottish, Gaelic, Welsh. Germanic languages, English, Old English, Norse, and these cultures are all related, and they were all thought of as separate, and they're really not. They're obviously related, and it really an interesting observation. And of course, this happened probably the usual use of this language, Proto-Indo-European, is 3000 BC. So it's at the end of the Kukuchini Tripilian culture. Now look at here. Here's a map of Europe, and Russian and Ukrainian, which are very closely related, all the Scandinavian languages, with the exception of Finnish, interestingly enough, and all the Baltic republics except Estonia, and virtually all of Central Europe, except, of all places, Hungary. And you can see those are the white ones, and of course not mostly Turkey or the Arabian Peninsula, which is where Arabic comes from, but all the way down Farsi in Iran and Hindustani are all related. I know, it's fascinating, and once again, and here's a really interesting thing. These are a few reconstructions of buildings from merely 100 years ago in the Ukraine. And I look at them and I go, geez, things didn't change very much. 100 years ago, they were building buildings that really didn't look that much different. I think it's fascinating. And there you see massive sort of log structure. Of course, they had no shortage of logs, although cutting a log in half with a stone axe is probably pretty painful. Now, here's a really interesting thing. The beginnings of Russia. I always wondered, what's the word Russian? Rus is actually the ancient name for Vikings. And the first real big sort of empire in the area we're talking about, centered on Kiev, which is now Ukraine, was the Kievian Rus Empire. And here, see this map? This is really interesting. You can see down at the bottom the Black Sea, and then connecting with the Mediterranean. And the power in the world at this point, in this part of the world, was Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire was still really important. And but look at the rivers connect all the way through, all the way up to the Baltic Sea. And the general thought is the people who started the leadership of the Kievan Rus state, the founder was a guy named Rurik the Rus. and Rurik the Rus was supposedly born in Sweden. And the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Danes were big Viking raiders in this period. And the richest town in Europe was Constantinople. So they were constantly going down there looking for booty. And the Varangians is another name for these Norse, you know. And they eventually found, and we see them here, the Kievan Rus Empire is from 800s to 1200s and centered on the town of Kiev, but going all the way up to Finland, right? And this is really amazing. And all the way down to the Black Sea, where they could connect with the Mediterranean. And this is really an interesting operation. Now, when you see pictures, obviously all modern pictures, of what these people look like, they often look like Vikings, you know. And of course, the dominant people from the culture were Vikings. They were coming down the rivers. Here's Rurik with an imagined portrait, and more imagined portraits. But looks like Viking to me. In almost all these images, remained in power until 879, and then his successors ran this Kievan Rus Empire. Now, here, I managed to acquire a decent amount of Kievan Rus artifacts, mostly from Ukraine. And here's a bracelet. It's made out of bronze. It looks exactly like a Viking bracelet. Unreal, you know. And that it's a piece of a brooch, and that's just total Viking. And I thought these are really fun. I blundered into this thing, and I can't imagine, I was really lucky. But this was preserved in a wet site, apparently. And this is a fragment of a wool sweater. And the wool sweater has little polished brass pieces clipped into it. And basically, this would have been shined up and glistening, and it would have looked, when you were, all the time, it would have made you look like you were wearing chainmail. Not really chainmail, but to me, this would have really appealed to, you know, cultures like the Vikings. Here's just a little fragment of some tapestries. And then some rings, which once again look just like Viking rings. They all look like snakes. These are bronze. Snakes curled around each other. Snakes curled around your finger. The Kievan Rus Empire had a thing for attacking the Byzantines. Of course, that was the wealthiest town in Europe, and Istanbul or Constantinople. And look at all the wars between the Rus and the Byzantines. And these are some Byzantine manuscripts where, if you've heard of the first use of flamethrowers was called Greek fire. That was Byzantine. And of course, the Byzantines spoke Greek. And so here's an image from, you know, maybe the year 1000, some of the battles. But here, now we're in the capital, Kiev, and Kiev was a walled city. The walls were actually made out of wood, but the gates were made out of brick. And the main gate to Kiev was called the Golden Gate. And it's the only fragment of the ancient city that survives. It's not in very good shape. Those are the two sides of the gate walls. And here's some old photos. Here's some images. It's got props to keep it from falling over. And here's an old Soviet postcard. But there's a reconstruction of what the wall would have looked like around the city. And there is the reconstructed Golden Gate in Kiev. And it has a church on top. It's an Orthodox church. And it's a very imposing looking thing. And you can see the wood parts there are imagined fragments of this continuous wall that went around the city. And you can see a few old stones incorporated into the thing. And when you go inside there, we're cutting right through where the wall was. And you go inside and you can see the fragments of the original pieces that are still there. You know, and you can only see them on the inside. But pretty amazing. And this would have been the gate to the city. And then here we are on top of this beautiful little church, very tall, vertical. Feels like some of the churches you might find in Greece, but it's older. And here was one of the descendants of Rurik the Rus, Yaroslav the Wise, an interesting guy. And this is the only image of him on a seal. And you know, with the pointy armored hat and the big mustache. And he's considered one of the founders of Ukraine. But really, Russia, because the empire went all the way up to Finland and all the western parts of Russia. There's an imagined view of Yaroslav the Wise. And Yaroslav converted the whole country to Christianity around the year 1000. And here's a little Orthodox Christian amulet found there. And here's Yaroslav. He had seen Hagia Sophia, the cathedral in Constantinople, and he was very impressed, and he said, well, we'll build a Hagia Sophia in Kiev. And they did. Here it is, St. Sophia in Kiev, and built around the year 1000, a little bit later. And the building is still completely intact, although it doesn't look like this anymore on the outside. But this is what it looked like when it was new. And there you can see it on the Ukrainian money. And here we're inside. And I don't know if you've been inside St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. Gold mosaics, glass mosaics are everywhere, and brilliantly colored. And this is very similar. The spans aren't as wide, but the ceiling's very tall. Amazingly well preserved inside. And then we're looking up into one of the domes. And there's some Baroque stuff from later. Now the outside has been completely changed because in the 1600s this became part of the Russian Empire. And give me a sec here. There's an old photograph of the outside of the building. You can see all those towers have caps on them in the Baroque style, probably done in the 1600s, 1700s. Here's the building today. And you can see there's little fragments of the brick structure showing through the things. And you know, you can imagine without the domes on it, that building is still there. But I'll have to say, it's a striking looking thing, you know, beautiful, and very well restored. And there it is from sort of above. And there's sort of the Kievan Rus Empire. Here's some more churches. Ultimately, the capital a few years later was transferred to Novgorod in the north, and then ultimately to Moscow. And here's medieval Ukraine. The castles really look like the rest of Europe. A lot of really big medieval castles. They look like the ones in Germany, really, in France. There's one in Switzerland that looks just like this, amazing. And once again, it was probably a pretty rough period. Same all over Europe. Here's some sort of churches that are less important, but interesting in that they reflect the others, but this one's made entirely out of wood. And here's another one made out of wood. So these northern countries, of course, have a lot of wood. That looks a lot like a stave church from Norway. Pretty interesting. Now, the Russian Empire, of course, it already existed, but they declared it to be an empire when Peter the Great in the 1600s. And look at the territory that it encompassed. You know, all of what became the Soviet Union, including Finland, including a pretty big chunk of Iran, and all the way out to the Korean Peninsula. And then look at the top there, Alaska. They had the whole thing. It was a Russian colony, and Alaska wasn't bought by the United States until after the Civil War. And if you go up there, you'll see lots of Orthodox churches that look just like this. Now, here's an amazing thing. This is a monastery in Kiev, and an Orthodox monastery, but the Monastery of the Cave it's called. And it is an absolute wonderland of Baroque buildings. It's hard to believe. It's just a beautiful thing. All these gold domes over the top. One building after the next, and you can see the town of Kiev behind it. And there's a few modern monuments, and multiple churches. Pretty amazing, beautiful things. It's bewildering the amount of buildings that are just in one place there. Here's a little cross from this period, from Ukraine. Here's something that happened during the Soviet period a lot. Stalin ordered a lot of religious buildings torn down. They tore down the cathedral in Moscow. And they tore down this monastery, the one on the right there. This is a photo taken before it was torn down. The bell tower's on the left, and the bell tower survived. And there's the building being demolished in the 1930s, right? And there's the building back again. It's just been completely rebuilt, as is Moscow Cathedral. It's interesting that the desire to have the building outlasted the politics that got rid of it. And it basically reappeared. Pretty amazing. And here's some of the icons. These are Orthodox religions, so Orthodox Christianity, so that they're really focused on icons. And these things are really beautiful. I got really into them. I have one in the little exhibit out there, and I have 5 more on the way that haven't gotten here from Ukraine. But now see this icon. This is the oldest icon in the world, and it's down in St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt in the Sinai Desert, and it's from the 6th century. And see this one. This is the most expensive painting ever sold. This is the newly rediscovered Leonardo da Vinci, called the Salvador Monday. And you can see that if you look at the pose and the look of the person, it hasn't changed a lot since the 6th century. Pretty amazing. And here's one that I bought from a fellow in Ukraine just a few weeks ago. It hasn't come yet. It has a polished metal face on it. But if you take the face off, there you can see it on the side. If you take the face off, it's the same image exactly underneath. And the crystal ball, of course, has become the Earth. But the pose is exactly the same. Now, here's an interesting thing. I hadn't realized, because, of course, for a long time, the Orthodox religion was, effectively illegal in the Soviet Union. But now it's not. And this woman actually has a shop that sells modern icons. And I look at these things, and they're pretty interesting. A lot of these look like pre-Raphaelite English stuff from the 19th century. But these are all in the last 10 years. And they're pretty interesting. Some of them look a little bit more medieval. And that one looks particularly medieval. Probably more medieval than the medieval ones really look. Yeah, pretty interesting. Now here's an incredible building that I wanted to mention, just because this is probably the most completely insane Art Nouveau building I've ever seen. It was built in 1911 in Kiev, and it's called the Palace of the Chimeras. And that thing is just crawling with strange creatures. You can see all those, they look like mermaids on the roof with their tails in the air. And yeah, eagles all over the place, And here, look at this. Look at the rhinos sticking out of the top of this thing. You won't see this anywhere else. Corinthian capitals with goats' heads on them. Yeah, and here's more rhinos and goats sticking out of the top of the thing. Amazing. This was actually during the Soviet Union. This was Communist Party headquarters for Kiev. And this is the plan, which is pretty amazing. Very sort of what you probably call Queen Anne revival in the West. And here's some of the interiors. Incredibly elaborate building. And this is stairway. These are birds' feet. I mean, this is out there. It's wild. And they say a lot of the murals have been painted over, unfortunately, but you can see the inside's just as nutty as the outside. Really interesting. And there's the current president of Ukraine. Often gives his office is across the street from this thing. And okay, now the Soviet Union begins, and the actual Soviet Union doesn't start maybe until 1921, although the revolution was earlier. But here's an artist, Kazimir Malevich from Ukraine, who really rises to prominence during the Soviet period. This is the first thing he did, and it's before, during the Tsarist Russian period. He designed a perfume bottle, which was in production for many, many years. And I managed to buy a bottle of this perfume that had never been opened. So I don't know how what it smells like, because I'm afraid to open it. But anyway, it has a bear on the top. Now, of course, the Russian Revolution takes place. There's Marx and Engels. And right, this way to progress. And of course, the basic idea of communism, or one of them, was getting rid of private property. And this was supposed to make the workers feel better. If they didn't have anything, nobody else did either. But I really think that Marx misread the way humans are. He really likes stuff. Anyway, but there you can see the Soviet Union, incredible. Big operation. You can see Ukraine is part of it there. And then here's Malevich during the period. And Malevich came up with a whole new aesthetic he called supremacism. And up here in the front, I've actually got one of the Bauhaus books published in 1927 by Walter Gropius that is by Kazimir Malevich. And here's his. He actually did representative paintings before, but after the revolution, things are different. This is two peasant women in 2 dimensions. And there's the white square painting. It's interesting when you see these real ones that it's not particularly square. Black cross. Once again, I don't think he used any straight edges. And black circle. And that supremacism and constructivism became a really interesting aesthetic. Here's they were published in the period. And there's a plate with Malevich's red square on it that's in our collection. And here's a teapot Malevich designed. This is incredible because the cups are half a cup, right? And the teapot is about the most complex shape you could ever imagine for a slip casting. And then here's a painted version of it. Now here's a teapot designed by Malevich. My label says 27, but this is probably more like 1923. And this is in modern production, but looks the same. Now, one of Malevich's students was a guy named Nikolai Suetin. And Suetin did a whole series of porcelain ceramic things. And we have all these in the conference room on the second floor of Copeland Hall. If you go in there past Chris's studio, you'll see these things. Just beautiful stuff, really interesting stuff. Yeah, early 1920s, there's another teapot. Even M&Ms are influenced by these aesthetics. I think that's pretty funny. But I wish it wouldn't do that. But Yakov Chernikov is another person born in Ukraine who was a tremendously talented architectural draftsman. And he was a great designer as well, but he only managed to get one building built. It's a nail factory in Moscow. But he published 2 or 3 books. The first one was black and white, and the later ones were in color. And these were of these incredible architectural fantasies. And these are just breathtaking. They're so interesting, you know. And this was in the mid 1920s, late 1920s, and sort of exaggerated perspective. Yeah. Now these ones are color lithographs. They were all in color. Beautiful things. Really interesting. And sadly, we never really saw any of these until, if you've seen Parc La Villette in Paris, it's inspired by these books. Bernard Sheen talked here last year, or the year before. This one almost looks like a refinery. Look at that, man. You can't always tell what's going on, but it's always interesting. You know, of course, none of this stuff actually got built, but it's amazing, you know, the creativity of Chernikov. And he also did things like, this is one of his typefaces. And later in his life, in the 1940s mostly, he started doing things that he never showed to anybody. And these are even more wild looking. They're sort of a strange combination of medieval city with modern industry. Look at this one. Unbelievable. They look like maybe like Piranesi in Italy. It might be a dam. It might be, you know, who knows what. I don't think he worried about what anything was. It was all just architecture. Really interesting, these towers. Towers as bridges. Unbelievable. You can see some. It does feel, you know, but Soviet and Russian. Here, look at that one. It's a reverse skyscraper with columns on the outside. Now, here, now we're in the 1950s in the Soviet Union, and the players that are going to talk about a change here are Khrushchev, who had replaced Stalin as the head of, Stalin died in, what was it, 53, and Khrushchev had a debate with Richard Nixon, who later became president, and at this point Nixon was vice president for Ike Eisenhower. And here's Nixon, and they're in 1959 at a trade fair in Moscow that was put on, and they're inside a geodesic dome built by Buckminster Fuller. And they're debating a American-style kitchen. And Nixon is trying to explain that, you know, these are what kitchens really look like in America, and Khrushchev is saying, oh no, this is just for show. And the interesting thing is this debate, which later be called the kitchen debate, they have the transcript of it on the internet, and I read it. And it's actually really funny because they're kind of poking fun at each other, and they're both very witty people. And it's interesting because there's a nice photo of them. You can see that just to the right of Nixon there is Brezhnev, who took over in 1964 from Khrushchev. And there's Khrushchev and Nixon. And they're all kind of pointing at each other. And, you know, Khrushchev says, I hear you're a lawyer. And Nixon says, yeah, but you'd make a better lawyer. And anyway, interesting event. And actually, they became really good friends. And when Khrushchev lost his job, Nixon was visiting and actually tried to visit with him. And really strange, you know, this is Russia and America. But Khrushchev really realized, though, and actually did come to the U.S. and he visited. He wanted to go to Disneyland, and they wouldn't let him. but he did go to some grocery stores, and he realized that the kind of products available in the U.S., you know, the Russians wanted the same, the Soviet Union wanted the same, and so here's some of the products that come out after that period. And they were really interesting. It was an organized effort to sell things that are similar to the ones in the West, but very different in that it was organized entirely by the state. And a lot of the design was simply replicas of European stuff, things that existed. The argument for that was that we don't have enough money for development of products, so we'll reproduce. But a lot of this stuff is unique, and there you can see the shape of an Electrolux vacuum, but cooler looking than an Electrolux. And then here's another one. I've got this one up in my office with the wheels. And beautiful graphics on the instruction sheet. And interestingly enough, when you buy these things, they kept all the paperwork, and you can find out exactly what year it was sold, who bought it, and the store it was sold at. You know, incredible. They actually were really, really. I think they felt it was very important to keep all the paperwork. You know, and this is the Saturnus, which interestingly enough, I mean, looks like the planet Saturn, but the word Saturnus is written in Latin. You know, pretty crazy. This is a Russian-only production, but or shall I say Soviet Union, because this is the Soviet Union. Hey, when I was trying to study Ukraine during the Soviet period, I realized that the culture was, much bigger than that one country which is now independent. And here's a car that sadly never made it into production. Actually, some of the most beautiful designs during the period never made it into production. Here's a taxi. And here's a tape player. And you see this is interesting. I've got a book here called Designed in the USSR. It's an exhibit that actually was in the US 2 years ago. And but a lot of these things were copies of Western stuff, and they would typically buy something they felt was the best. This is a desk fan by the Braun Company in Germany, probably from the mid-1950s, right? And there's the Russian version. Looks almost exactly the same. The plastic isn't quite as shiny, and you can see the two of them next to each other in the exhibit. Now, but here's an interesting thing. It's not a replica of a Western fan. Most Western fans have cages around the outside to keep your finger out of the blades. This one actually has rubber blades, and it's called the Penguin. And the part that holds the rubber blades actually is painted black on one side and white on the other, so it has a sort of a slightly penguin-y look. And but here, you realize the difference here. This was sold in 1969. It was given as a birthday present to a person who worked at a collective, probably in the Ukraine. And but this thing still works, and it still was used and valued. And this kind of stuff was valued by people, but it was rare. It was rare. It was never common like it is in the West. And people actually were very protective of stuff. Here's a lamp from the period. Interestingly enough, it's a copy of a Soviet-style lamp designed in Holland in 1955. So it's the aesthetic is very Soviet, but it's actually a replica of the Western one. And this is in the exhibit. I cleaned the blue paint off. And then here's some record players. And but the Western world is very throwaway. Everybody had dozens of TV sets. These were rare. These were valued. They were kept, and when they broke, they were repaired. Now that fan is actually made out of cast iron. It's the herkiest thing you've ever seen. Go over and pick it up. It'll knock you out. It's sturdy. Here's another interesting thing. This is a crazy little device which was so common in Russia, which is a collapsible cup. And you just put, here's an interesting thing. They had drink machines in Russia, in the Soviet Union, but they didn't come with paper cups. They had actually a glass cup that you were supposed to wash. And people tended to use their own cups, and they walked around. And we think of the problems with all the disposable dinnerware stuff we have today. We're constantly buying stuff and then throwing it away. And here's a solution. Pretty inexpensive. Worked really well. Here's a Soviet replica of a Dutch Philips double head shaver. except the Philips one is all white. The Russian one is white and red. It's actually a little bit cooler. And but you realize the level of production was very small because the serial number on this shaver is actually etched in by hand. You know, they had to do that for each one. Pretty amazing. I wish you would do that. Now, that's a replica of a Western shaver, but this is an entirely Soviet design. And it's really an interesting thing. This is a wind-up electric shaver. And the one that I have is 50 years old, and it works perfectly. Nobody will mind if you pick it up, and there's a lever on the top, and you can turn it on. And it still works perfectly 50 years later. It's pretty amazing. This stuff is heavy duty. And here's some of the cameras. This is a replica of a Leica, which was considered the top 35 millimeter camera. And it looks exactly like a Leica, except for the names are different. And in fact, you can pull screws out of this one and put it in a real Leica. All the threads are the same. And then here's a development of the Leica with a single lens reflex top on it. This is probably from the early 1950s. What a beautiful thing, that's amazing. It's called a Zenith. And here's a crazy one. Interestingly enough, the product of Kiev, but it's a spy camera. It's a tiny little spy camera designed to fit in their pocket. And it uses 16 millimeter movie film. And it's the most beautifully made thing you ever saw. It's a little bit weird. It's very Cold War, you know. Anyway, you can see there's the film holder. And then here's the last camera that was really popular. It's once again a replica of a Western one, a replica of a Japanese camera. And it came out in 1984 called the Lomo. And it's a modern camera, film camera still, of course, but automatic, electric, with automatic lighting. And beautiful little thing called the Lomo. And these things were really popular. And there's one being used. You can see how tiny it is. It's in the display case. And there's a guy. Now, here's the craziest thing that's happened in just the last couple days, last couple of years. A bunch of enthusiasts in Russia started using these older cameras, and you know, a lot of young people haven't used film cameras before, and they called it Lomography after the Lomo camera. And the headquarters is actually in their factory is now in Vienna, but they're still in production, and they're pretty interesting. And the idea is that a lot of the weird quirks that would happen with old film cameras, people have gotten to like, and they actually sell film with tints. So here's some of the purple tinted film, and there's a yellow tinted film, and there's a pink tinted film. And they call it lomography, which is strange chemical photography. There's one of the, of course, when these were sold in the Soviet Union, they were very inexpensive. They're not anymore. But look at it, turquoise film. Now, a lot of times people think that the Soviet Union didn't have any sense of humor. This is Gina the Crocodile, a cartoon from the period. And I've got one of these coming in the mail. But here was the most popular toy from the whole period. And I got one right here. And it is just the cutest thing you've ever seen. And here, I'll put the mic next to it, right? This doesn't look like a bunch of heartless commies to me. This is pretty interesting. It's a beautiful little thing. And virtually every one of the artifacts that I bought, you know, are Soviet, but they're from Ukraine. Sadly, since the invasion, the Russians had shut down their international postal system, so you can't buy anything from Russia anymore. And so, but the Ukrainian postal service actually is still in business. Pretty amazing. Now here's the end. But this is a minority group in Western Ukraine, the Ussrs, and they have a tremendous craft thing called Pisanski, and they take regular eggs, hen's eggs, and they use a pen which dispenses melted wax, and they make the lines on these things completely by hand, and it looks big here. And this is a regular hen's egg, you know. This one is actually in the case. In the Orthodox religion, you know, for in America, you know, Christmas is the most important Christian holiday. Easter is the most important Christian holiday there, and so eggs are really important. And here's the wax dispenser. This is using black tinted wax. And then, but once again, you probably dipped Easter eggs in dye when you were a kid, and this is just a tremendously sophisticated development of that thing. And they also dip it in colors, but they usually use about 4 different dips, and amazing things. Here you can see one that's orange, and then they're adding more resistance. They start with the lightest colors and move to the darkest. And then here's the Pisanski Museum in Ukraine, and there's a collection of 10,000 Pisanski eggs. Look at all these things, just unreal. And it's interesting to compare this aesthetic, you know, with the old Tripilian culture, you know, from so many years ago. And you realize that, you know, things change, but then a lot of things stay the same. These things are so miraculous. I thought that they must be made with some kind of tool that makes the line straight. No, they just do this freehand, and they do it this nicely because they're just really practiced at it. Hard to believe. Yeah. I'll end with this one. There's one with the symbol of Ukraine on it, and there's a coin from Yaroslav the Wise, where the symbol originated. And but anyway, it's just fascinating. I hope this has been interesting. This is just the things I've learned in the last few months. But I think it's interesting. And maybe we can all have a look at some of this stuff and see what we think. Anybody have any questions? See, I made it. I'm only 1 minute over. Thank you very much, folks.